We're going to start this puppy up. Clear? Prop.
And welcome back to building the Affordaplane. Now we're going to take a pause from building the wings so that we can attack the ailerons. And that's because it's much easier to handle the wing before we install all the ribs and whatnot on it. So in these next two parts, we're going to finish our ailerons and then get back to the wing. So let's get started. So this is where we start constructing our ailerons. We have two ailerons. Each one will be made pretty much identical to the other. To work on the ailerons, our first step is going to be building the hinges that go between the aileron spar, which is this 1 1/8 diameter tubing, and the rear spar of the wing. So you need your wing up here. This is the rear spar, and I'm looking at the top of the starboard or right wing. And the hinges will be built between, of course, the rear spar of the wing and the aileron spar. Now, we're going to first put the hinges onto the wing, and the first step, of course, is locating where the hinges go. So we can set our spar, aileron spar, aside for now, because we want to work on half of the hinges at this point. Now, before we map out the exact locations of the hinges, it's very important to reestablish our center line on the back side of the wing spar. This center line is going to be used all the way down the length of the wing to make sure that hinge line stays right in line. Otherwise, we're going to have some problems with the movement of the ailerons on those hinges. So if you notice, I've redrawn the line. This may have gotten rubbed off when you first put it on there. Another method, if your line has rubbed off, is to take a ruler, and as long as the spar is flat and your ruler is 90 degrees to that, you can scrape along the spar. Just scrape, and it will leave a line precisely at the highest point facing you, and that will help you redraw your line, because obviously you can't get your positioning blocks back on the tube anymore. So step one is to establish that line all the way down the spar, the rear spar of the wing. That's very important to have that. Our next step then is to locate where along that line the hinges are going to go. Now, of course, the hinges are going to be the same ones that we've used before. One goes against one side, the other set goes along the other. So we want to establish getting our hinges in place at the right spot along here. Now, as I did before, I'm going to connect my hinges together with a nut and bolt, and the hinge line that I refer to will be the center where the two come together. Now, in locating, we're going to have 4 hinges along each wing. In locating where they go, and of course they'll go with our line right down the center of those holes, is we got to remember that we have sleeves installed at various locations. Remember, we had a 12-inch sleeve, and this is the root of the wing where we attach to the fuselage. We have a 12-inch sleeve, and we want to make sure our hinge goes on the sleeve because that adds more strength, more durability to the rivet connection. And so I have drawn a 2-inch line, and everything 2 inches from the end, and this is going to be the start of the aileron spar. And everything I measure will be from this point going that way. So my first point is at 8 inches. And what that means is the hinge will sit centered on the 8-inch mark. And notice that's well within the sleeve. Here's where my 12 inches ends, right here. So my first hinge will go here. It's going to end up being 3 and 6 3/16 rivets that go in at this location. Our next hinge will be further down at the location of our next sleeve. And if you recall, we had an 8-inch sleeve down at this location. And that's why I mark where these sleeves are from here to here. And my next hinge is going to go at the 53 1/4, again measured from that 2-inch mark I made at the end at the root of the wing. And this will be well within the sleeve here. I've come up with these positions because it keeps them away from the bolts, significant distance away from the bolts, and yet still within the sleeve area, so that we get a good attachment strength-wise between that hole and the end of the sleeve. We have a third hinge. Our third hinge goes onto our 12-inch sleeve as we move down, and this one will go right here. Now, it's easier to measure from the far end. I've written a 40 here. That is 40 inches from the end of the aileron, which I'll show you where that is in a moment. And then we have one more hinge, which won't be on the sleeve because we don't have a sleeve at the far end of the wing. And that will be all the way down here. Remember that 6 inches from here to here is our wing tip tube. So we want, and that ends right here. So we want to stay away from that. And so I'm going to put mine right here. No sleeve, but at least it keeps it away from our tube that ends over there. The end of the aileron, because our aileron spar is 141 3/4 inches, ends right here at this mark. And that's measured from the 2-inch mark down where we started. So this 8-inch hinge line is measured from the end. And the last hinge I showed you was 40 inches from this mark. So enough about talking about where hinges go. Let's start putting a hinge on. So a clamp, or even a spring clamp, is useful in holding this. And the more care you take in getting everything precise will make the hinges operate easier. So I'm going to start by marking a hole and center punching it very carefully drilling it, and then clecoing the hinge back in and lining it up again, and then catch one of the holes on the other side. So in other words, just do it one hole at a time until you get it in place, perfectly lined up, and then you can go pop the other holes through. So no rocket science here, just a matter of using your best technique to locate. Again, I'm always using a center punch to precisely get the point I want the drill to follow, and always start with a small drill like an 1/8 inch or even smaller to get that first point started. And so I marked and drilled 2 small holes, and when I confirm that they line up nicely, I can drill them out to full size, cleco them, and then get the rest of them. Now I'll still mark and drill these starting small, and then I can push the 3/16 bit directly through with this in place and get a very perfect set of holes that way. So we're using the hinge as the drill guide, so to speak. Now, we're ready for the rivets. Make sure you're using a rivet with enough grip for the hinge, about 50 thou, and then 2 0.58 thousandths because this is sleeved. And so we'll rivet these using our large squeezer. And if a rivet won't go in, it's okay to take the drill and pass it gently through, and that will clean out the burrs. And it will put it in. And continue till we're done. And then we'll move on to the next. And there's our first hinge done, and we move to the next one right at this location. And to review, this is at the 53 1/4 mark inside of the sleeve and to the right of our bolt. And from number 2 to number 3, so here's our last hinge and a review of the other 3. Now we need to go get our aileron spar and set it next to these hinges and attach. Now the aileron spar is 1 1/8 diameter tube, 12 feet long. We will trim the end of it in a moment. And our first step is to draw a line all the way, the full length on one side, and then the same on the opposite side, 180 degrees away. Use your blocks to get a nice accurate line on both sides. One of the lines, of course, is going to help us line up the hinges, so we want all of our hinges exactly along that same line. And the other line we're going to use for the ribs when we start drilling holes in the spar for the ribs. So once that's completed, we now need to move to the very end of the spar. The end of the spar is where we're going to have a horn so that we can rotate the ailerons, and the horn needs to attach to a series of sleeved tubes. So we have 1 1/8. We have a 1 inch, 8 inches long. Verify in your plans. This is going to slide in with 1 inch remaining, and then inside of that, inside the 1 inch, is a 7/8 inch tube, and that will slide in all the way till it's even. So we have 2 sleeves here that protrude 1 inch out, and we will attach these by marking a point 3 3/4 inches down, drilling a hole and setting a 3/16 stainless steel rivet, and the same with the opposite side. Verify these dimensions in your plans. So that rivet will hold all 3 sleeves, all 3 tubes together. So I'm going to go ahead and mark and drill that while making sure that this sits on the 1 inch line. This is where the horn will attach. And here I have riveted the sleeves in. Now I riveted my sleeves 90 degrees from the line, so they're not on the lines, they're 90 degrees from the lines. That was my choice, and my rivets are approximately 3.5 inches out. Now the total length of the aileron spar, and check your plans with this, is 141 3/4 inches, and that's measured from the end here all the way to the other end, and then I cut it. I drew a line on my wing spar, the rear spar, 2 inches in, because 2 inches is where the aileron spar begins. So that is to be lined up. Let's go look at the other end so we can see where that lies. And on my wing, the end of the aileron spar is just short by about 1/4 inch of the wing spar. So that's where the aileron ends, just short of the wing spar. Now the next step is to locate the hinges against the aileron spar. Because the hinges are now affixed to the wing spar, and we have our aileron spar 2 inches in from the edge, as we discussed, we can now mark where all of the hinges will sit on the aileron spar. Notice how I have assembled a hinge right here by using a nut and bolt to add the other half of the hinge. So if we roll up our aileron spar, keeping the end of the aileron at the 2-inch mark, we can then see where the hinges lay on our spar. Now keep in mind we need to put the line underneath the hole, should be centered on the holes. I have raised my wing spar up about 3/4 inch or so to be able to prop this up so that it's easier to see. You will note the spacing wood that I placed under the spar to raise this up. The purpose of doing that is that I want to mark where the hinges are going to be located. I'm literally going to mark them on here so that I can remember where a hinge goes. These are just approximate markings. And I'm going to do that for all the way down at each of the 4 hinges along the way. That way I have a visual mark that shows where the hinge is going to appear along the spar. Because in a moment we're going to have to locate the ribs of the aileron, and we don't want them messing with the location of the hinges. Now this is important, pay attention. There are 7 ribs that will be installed on our aileron spar. The first rib is specified at 4¼ inches in from the edge, and that'll go right on our center line. So I put a tick mark and marked an R. That's our first rib. Now the subsequent ribs are approximately 24 inches from the preceding rib. So I've started my tape measure, and let's go see where 24 inches goes. And here is 24 inches, so I'm going to mark that location on here. Now here's where the first problem comes up. Our third rib at the 48 mark is right here, but if you can see, this is where the hinge is located. So we don't want to put a rib where the hinge attaches, because for obvious reasons it won't work out that way. So I am going to back up 3 inches, 1, 2, 3, at the 45 mark and put the rib at the 45 mark. Be right here. And I'll mark that with an R. That'll be my R3. Third rib. Okay. Now let's move down 2 feet from this and see where that lies. 2 feet later is right here. No hinge, no obstruction, so I've marked across my center line R4. That's the 4th one. Let's move down another 24 inches. And our 5th rib at the 8-foot mark on this tape ruler is right here, which is out of the way of the hinge over there, so that is wonderful. Let's move down 2 more feet. Since there is only 43 inches left between our last rib, number 5, and the end of the spar, I'm splitting 43 in half, which is 21 and a half, and my 6th rib will go at 21 and a half. The last rib, of course, will go towards the end of the spar. And here's the location of our 6th rib. Our next step now is to accurately locate a mark at each of these rib locations on the other side of the tube. In other words, along this line. Now, the easiest way to do that is to use one of your positioning blocks and center the hole right over your mark very carefully. Put your finger on it and rotate and mark the hole on the other side. The reason we need to do that is we're going to create a 1/2-inch hole that goes all the way through this tube, and we need an accurate starting point here and on the other side. And we'll enlarge our small holes up to 1/2 inch because our ribs consist of 1/2-inch tubes going directly through the spar. I will demonstrate the first one. So we start with a 1/8 inch hole at the rib location on both sides. Now I will simply start up drilling these in steps, 3/16, quarter, and then we're going to end up at 1/2 an inch. We're at a 1/4 inch. Now we're going to go up to 3/8. Then turn around to the other side, so I'm doing each side one at a time until we reach our full 1/2 inch. And then finally 1/2 inch. And we should be able to go all the way through. And we will deburr and then test it. And this is a scrap piece of 1/2 inch tubing. This is what the ribs will be made out of. And that's what we want. So we need to continue making 6 more holes at each of the rib locations that we earlier defined. Well, we've run out of time, but I'll see you next week where we'll finish up these ailerons. So in the meantime, back to building.